Hey everyone, I'm going to today discuss the United States federal budget. And the reason I'm going over the federal budget a little bit sounds a little boring at first, and truth be told, part of it probably is. So I'll give myself the scrutiny there. But the reason I'm going over it is to show you that it's really difficult to actually spend money on certain things that we want, or to cut money when you actually see how little in the grand scheme of things we're spending on things. So just an overview, in 2015, we don't obviously have the data for 2016 yet, the IRS collected $2 trillion in taxes. There was another $1.13 trillion in investments. So that thing comes from things like uh, trust funds or stocks. The government actually invests in those things because they provide a higher rate of return on certain things. So if the government wants to get money over a long-term period, as you should want to get money over a long-term period, then stocks or mutual funds or the like are great investments. And Social Security and Medicare rely heavily on this, actually. In fact, much of our debt goes to pay for some of these investments. So we invest the money with borrowed money, but then get it back. There was $538 billion borrowed, issued in treasury bonds and other sources. Overall, the budget made up a 3.25 trillion spent. So you could see there was that 583 billion gap. It was about 20% of gross domestic product. Remember, gross domestic product is all of the money, so to speak, that the country makes, or all of the money that the economy generates. It was about 20% of that. It's about 18 to 20 trillion. You're going to see a lot of graphs in this video, and a lot of them come from national priorities. You can see here where some of the money came from. Again, 2.05 trillion from tax revenue and federal funds, 1.13 from trust funds and whatnot. And you can see exactly where it comes from. Excise taxes are in there, customs duties are in there. You can see customs and excise taxes really didn't pay that much. So, it's one of those things that we should talk. We've talked about in this unit. Should we increase excise taxes, for example, on soda, or if we are talking about trade, which is a very hot topic in the current election. It doesn't really generate that much money for us, but if we were to increase tariffs, that would increase the customs duties, but it really wouldn't increase it that much when we're looking in the grand scheme. 1.7 billion is, less than, well less than 1%. This is where the money was actually spent, and you can see that much of this is this green mandatory spending. Well, what is that? This is mostly payments on Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. It got a little bit bigger, obviously, with more people entering Medicaid because of the Affordable Care Act. But it also is things like transportation or defense or roads, things that are mandatory that have to be spent. Could be servicing debt. There's interest on federal debt that's there too. You can see this yellow part is really what's left to spend on things like the military or veterans benefits or Medicaid or education. I'm sorry, not Medicaid, Medicare. On government pay, on developing new cars that fly, or laser beams attached to sharks' heads. That's what's left in the yellow. And you can see here just how much of that is spent. And this is just that yellow part on the last graph. About 1 trillion is this section total. It's about a third of the budget. But this is how much we have to spend. On science, it's not too much. You can go to nationalpriorities.org and actually find this graph and then click on each circle or each color to see how much is there. Transportation. This is not just. This isn't necessarily roads. It could be developing. It could be grants to develop more fuel efficient cars, for example. Food and agriculture did not get that much. Most of our discretionary spending goes to the military. It's about a little over $500 billion. And so the federal government, when you look at spending right now, has allocated about $500 billion for all these other things. There's also talk about, with the budget, the debt ceiling. And the debt ceiling has been is something that Congress limits how much the Treasury can spend on payments by law. Congress, because they control the power of the purse, and the Treasury really falls under the executive branch, Congress is responsible for saying how much someone can spend. The Treasury makes over 80 million payments, which include to Social Security recipients, bondholders, people who buy T-bills and then they want to collect that interest, servicing debt. Most of these things are already authorized by Congress. In the past couple of years, really in the past, I would say 4 or 5 years, there's been debate on whether Congress should increase the debt ceiling because our debt is around 17 trillion, so almost at 100% of GDP, which is usually not a good sign. Usually when it gets to 100% of GDP, there's the concern that, all right, we're going to start servicing debt too much, and then that little sliver that you saw out of the third of that budget becomes smaller and smaller, and the portion of the debt circle graph gets bigger, and it hurts the economy, generally speaking, because now we have to increase taxes, and that creates problems. So the thinking is, well, if we limit the debt ceiling, then we're kind of saying we're only going to pay this much in debt. We can't afford to pay anymore. We need to take care of ourselves first. This logic actually works really well sometimes on a personal level. Sometimes if someone's too wrapped in debt, then they do need to renegotiate those limits so they can get out of it. Sometimes that can be done individually with the creditors themselves. But on a federal level, this is a problem. First off, many of these payments, like I said, have already been authorized by Congress. Secondly, just take Social Security recipients for as example. These are people who are on disability, who are elderly, who aren't working most of the time. And they're on a fixed income, so they really rely on that money. Third, because people buy treasury bonds as part of their retirement plans or as their investment plans, when the government says we're not going to pay those, it actually hurts those investments. And it's not just American citizens that own them, it's people that are around the world. So businesses are hurt by it, international businesses are hurt by it, and generally speaking, the faith in the U.S. dollar is also hurt by it, and the U.S. dollar allows us to buy things at a much greater rate than if we are on the yuan, for example. But the argument was to create a tighter government, and to some degree we could appreciate the sentiment behind that. We want people to they want the government to have a healthy economy and a healthy budget. That's great, but unfortunately the consequences were there, and you can see how much the debt ceiling has increased over the years in this graph. Really, from 2014 to 2010, it really hasn't increased that much, and it's also been increased numerous times when, even when the economy was healthy. So, like I said, it's been raised over 100 times since the early 20th century, and isn't really a part of necessarily the health of the economy or the rest of the budget.